Welcome to Apex Storyteller, where tales unfold to guide you into the perfect night's rest. Take a moment to subscribe. It's the simplest way to stay connected with stories that transport you far away from the noise of the world. As you settle into your cozy spot, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to know how far these words travel. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the story begin. But let me warn you, tonight's tale may leave you questioning what's real and what's just beyond the shadows. What would you do if you heard a knock at your door, 3 sharp taps, long after midnight? You peek through the curtains and there's no one there. But then, it happens again, louder this time. The kind of knock that demands you open up. Would you dare turn the handle, or would you freeze, knowing that what's waiting outside might not belong in this world? The knock came again. 3 sharp raps, slicing through the stillness of the night. Sarah sat frozen in her living room, the glow of the television flickering against her wide eyes. It was nearly 2 a.m., and her quiet, sleepy town wasn't the kind of place where unexpected visitors showed up, especially not at this hour. Her fingers tightened around the blanket draped over her lap as the sound echoed again. Louder. More insistent. Her heart pounded as she stared at the door, willing herself to move, to look, to confirm there was nothing there. But every instinct screamed to stay put. Maybe it's just the wind, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. But she knew better. The night was still, the air heavy with an unsettling quiet. No trees swayed, no leaves rustled outside her window. Gathering her courage, she stood up, the wooden floor creaking beneath her bare feet. Slowly, she crept toward the front door. She didn't dare switch on the porch light. She wanted to see without being seen. Her eyes darted to the small peephole, her breath catching in her throat as she hesitated. What if there was someone there? Or worse, what if there wasn't? Sarah's trembling hand reached for the doorknob. Her heart felt like it might burst as she pressed her eye to the peephole. At first, all she saw was darkness. But then, just as she was about to step away, a pale face flashed into view. She stumbled back, gasping. The face was wrong. Hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and a grin that seemed stitched into its flesh. It didn't knock again. It just stared, unmoving, its grin widening as though it knew she was watching. Sarah's mind raced. She thought about calling the police, but what would she even say? There's a face at my door that doesn't look human? They'd dismiss her as paranoid, or worse, insane. The television in the background crackled, pulling her attention. Static filled the screen, though she hadn't touched the remote. Slowly, distorted voices began to emerge from the white noise, whispering her name. Sarah? Her blood ran cold. She spun back toward the door, only to find the face was gone. But before she could exhale in relief, the knock started again, this time from the back door. Her knees buckled as fear overtook her. The back door led to the kitchen, where she hadn't drawn the curtains. Anyone, or anything, could be standing there watching her. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed her best friend, hoping she'd pick up despite the late hour. Come on, she whispered, her voice breaking. The line connected, but all she heard was static. And then the same distorted voice. Sarah, open the door. She screamed and dropped the phone, her body paralyzed with terror. The knocks grew louder, echoing from every corner of the house now. Front door, back door, even the windows. Her cozy, familiar home had become a prison, surrounded by something relentless and cruel. Desperate, Sarah clutched a kitchen knife and backed into a corner, her eyes darting around the room. And then, as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. Silence. She waited, heart hammering, ears straining to catch any sound. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, she dared to hope it was over. But then she saw it. A single, handwritten note slipped under the front door. The paper was old and yellowed, the ink smeared as though written in haste. With trembling hands, she picked it up and read the chilling words. You shouldn't have looked. Her scream was swallowed by the night. The note trembled in Sarah's hands as her mind raced. You shouldn't have looked. She stared at the jagged letters, each stroke of ink radiating malice. Who, or what, had written this? Her instinct screamed to flee, but flee where? She was alone, trapped in the suffocating quiet of her home. A sickening thought slithered into her mind. Was she even safe inside? The sudden creak of a floorboard snapped her attention to the hallway leading to her bedroom. She hadn't moved since the knocking started. The house was supposed to be empty, wasn't it? Hello? She called out, regretting it the moment the word escaped her lips. The sound of her voice felt too loud, almost intrusive, like it didn't belong in the thick, unnatural silence that enveloped the house. Nothing answered. Clutching the knife tighter, she moved cautiously toward the hallway, her breath shallow and her pulse erratic. Each step felt like a betrayal, the creaks under her feet breaking the stillness and announcing her presence. When she reached the end of the hallway, she paused outside her bedroom door. It was open. She was certain she had closed it before settling in for the night. She pressed her back against the wall, inching closer to the doorway, and peeked inside. The room was empty, but something was off. The window that faced the backyard was wide open, the curtains billowing despite the absence of any wind. Her stomach churned. Had someone been inside? Were they still here? She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning every corner. The closet door was ajar, revealing only darkness within. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, that the knocking, the note, the face at the door were all some cruel trick her mind was playing on her. But then she noticed the footprints. They started at the open window, faint but undeniable, trailing across the carpet. They weren't hers. They were too large, and the pattern was strange, bare feet, but the prints were elongated, as though the toes were unnaturally long and clawed. The trail stopped abruptly at her bed. Her throat tightened as she looked closer. On the edge of the bed, there was another note, identical to the one slipped under her door. The same yellowed paper, the same jagged handwriting. This one read, "Why did you let me in?" A chill gripped her and she staggered back. She hadn't let anyone in, had she? Her mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of the night, searching for anything that could explain the horror unraveling around her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed from the floor where she had dropped it. The screen lit up with a message. "Look behind you." Her heart nearly stopped. She froze, unable to turn, every nerve screaming that if she did, whatever was there would become real. But the buzzing continued, relentless, as though mocking her fear. With every ounce of courage she could muster, she spun around, knife raised. The hallway was empty. The house was silent again. But her phone buzzed once more. This time the screen showed a photo. It was her standing in the hallway holding the knife. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was the face. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted grin. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone or something was watching her from inside the house. Panic surged through her as she grabbed her phone and bolted toward the front door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the key. When she finally managed to open the door, she stumbled outside, gasping for air. The street was eerily quiet. No cars, no lights in the neighboring windows, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as though the world had been drained of life. But she wasn't alone. Across the street, standing under the flickering glow of a street lamp, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, but Sarah felt its gaze piercing through her. And then, as if in response to her terror, it took a step forward. Sarah backed away, her feet slipping on the damp grass. The figure took another step, then another, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it didn't fully understand how to walk. She turned and ran, her bare feet pounding against the pavement. She didn't know where she was going, she just needed to get away. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, keeping pace with her frantic escape. She glanced back, and the figure was closer now, its hollow eyes locked on her. She turned a corner, hoping to lose it, but the street she found herself on was unfamiliar. The houses looked strange, windows dark, doors ajar, like they had been abandoned in a hurry. In the distance, she saw a faint light spilling from an open doorway. It was the only sign of life, the only hope she had. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the sharp pain in her feet. When she reached the door, she hesitated for only a second before plunging inside. The warmth of the light was a stark contrast to the cold, empty night outside, but it offered no comfort. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single chair in the center and a table covered in old, dusty papers. The door slammed shut behind her, and she spun around, expecting to see the figure. Instead, there was nothing. The room felt wrong, the air heavy and oppressive. On the table, one of the papers caught her eye. It was another note, written in the same jagged handwriting. This one said, "You can't run." Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the note on the table. The words felt like a taunt, a cruel reminder that no matter how far she ran, the nightmare would follow her. Her trembling fingers brushed against the jagged writing as though touching the paper might make it vanish. "You can't run." She dropped the note as if it burned her, her eyes darting around the room. Something about the house felt off, as if it wasn't entirely real. The walls seemed to close in ever so slightly, their edges blurred, and the warm light flickered like it was fighting to stay alive. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the floor beneath her feet sounded like a scream. A faint sound drifted through the air, so soft she wasn't sure if she imagined it, a low, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Her heart thundered as she turned toward the darkened hallway that stretched beyond the room. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as though it were beckoning her. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "I'm not going in there." But even as she said it, her feet moved forward, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. The hallway seemed impossibly long, the shadows clinging to the walls like living things. Each step felt heavier than the last, her body screaming for her to turn back, to run. The tapping grew louder. Sarah's hand tightened around the knife she still carried, though it felt like a flimsy defense against whatever waited for her in the dark. The hallway opened into another room, its doorway yawning like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. She hesitated at the threshold, her breath hitching as she peered inside. The room was empty, save for an old wooden rocking chair in the center. It swayed gently back and forth, the tapping sound coming from its legs against the floor. There was no one there to move it. Her stomach twisted as she took a cautious step inside. The air was colder here, each breath fogging in front of her face. She reached out with her free hand, gripping the back of the chair to stop its movement. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence felt almost comforting, until she realized she wasn't alone. A reflection caught her eye in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. She turned toward it, her heart dropping as she saw the figure standing behind her. It was the same face she'd seen at her door, hollow eyes, stretched skin, and that horrible, stitched grin. But now it was closer, so close she could feel its icy breath against her neck. Sarah spun around, knife raised, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. "Stop it," she screamed, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The only answer was a faint whisper, carried on the cold air. "You let me in." The rocking chair creaked again, its movement slow and deliberate, though no one sat in it. Sarah backed away, her mind spiraling with fear. She stumbled into the hallway, her hand brushing against the wall as she tried to steady herself. But the wall wasn't solid. Her fingers sank into the surface, which felt soft and warm, almost like flesh. She yanked her hand back, staring in horror as the wall seemed to pulse, veins crawling beneath its surface. The house was alive. A guttural sound rose from deep within the structure, like a low growl reverberating through the walls. Sarah bolted, her only thought to get out, to escape this nightmare. She ran back toward the front door, but it was no longer there. The room where she had entered was gone, replaced by another hallway, identical to the one she had just fled. The house was shifting, trapping her in its labyrinth. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Just let me go." The walls seemed to shudder in response, and then she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They were coming closer. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her knife clutched tightly in her hand. The footsteps stopped just outside the hallway, and she held her breath, praying it wouldn't find her. But then the whispers began. "Sarah, you can't hide." The voice was distorted, layered, as though 100 voices spoke in unison. It grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to stop the sound. And then the face appeared again. This time, it was inches from hers, its hollow eyes locking onto her own. "You're mine now," it hissed. Before she could scream, everything went black. The darkness wasn't empty. It pressed against Sarah, suffocating her, wrapping her in its cold, sticky embrace. She couldn't tell if she was awake or dreaming, or if something even worse had happened. Her senses returned slowly, but the world around her didn't feel right. She was lying on something hard and cold, the texture rough beneath her fingers. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust and decay. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she gasped. She wasn't in the house anymore. She was in a tunnel. The walls were made of jagged stone, glistening with moisture, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the air. A dim, flickering light came from somewhere ahead, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. Sarah sat up, her body aching as though she had been dropped from a great height. The knife was still in her hand, and she gripped it tightly, the only source of comfort she had left. Her heart pounded as she tried to piece together what had happened. The house, the figure, the whispers, it all felt like a nightmare. But the cold, sharp edges of the stone beneath her were real. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, the darkness behind her seeming to swallow the faint light that came from ahead. And then she heard it. A low, guttural sound like something breathing. It came from the darkness behind her, deep and resonant, vibrating through the stone. She froze, her every instinct screaming at her to run. But where? The tunnel offered no safety, no escape. The breathing grew louder, closer, accompanied by a wet, slithering sound. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned toward the light and started walking, her steps quick and uneven. The light grew brighter as she moved, and the tunnel opened into a cavernous room. The space was enormous, the ceiling lost in shadows. Strange markings covered the walls, carved deep into the stone and glowing faintly with an eerie green light. In the center of the room was a circular platform, surrounded by flickering candles that dripped thick black wax onto the ground. On the platform lay an object wrapped in cloth, its shape obscured but somehow familiar. Sarah's breath hitched as she stepped closer. The object seemed to pulse as though it were alive. She reached out, hesitating just before her fingers touched the cloth. "Don't," a voice whispered, sharp and urgent. She spun around, her knife raised, but there was no one there. The room was empty, at least it looked empty. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The air seemed to vibrate, and the voice came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. But the shadows were too thick, and the flickering candlelight only made them seem alive. "Who are you?" she whispered. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the cloth on the platform began to shift, as though something beneath it was moving. Sarah stepped back, her chest tightening. The object's shape became clearer as the cloth slipped away, revealing a crude wooden box, its surface covered in the same glowing markings as the walls. The box seemed to hum, a low rhythmic vibration that resonated in her bones. She couldn't look away, her gaze drawn to the intricate carvings that spiraled across its surface. And then, with a sudden violent crack, the box split open. A wave of cold air rushed out, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing as she clutched the knife tighter. The breathing was back, but this time it was all around her. The voice returned, louder now, filling the cavern with its menacing tone. "You opened the door." "I didn't," Sarah cried, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I don't know what's happening." The room began to shake, the ground trembling beneath her feet. The markings on the walls flared brighter, casting the cavern in an otherworldly green glow. And then she saw it. Emerging from the shattered box was a figure, its form shifting and unstable, like a shadow-given substance. Its hollow eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far beyond what was humanly possible. "You let me out," it hissed, its voice layered and distorted. Sarah's legs buckled, and she fell to the ground, her knife slipping from her grasp. The figure moved toward her, its steps slow and deliberate, as though savoring her terror. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The figure crouched before her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "It's as real as you made it," it said. Before she could react, the figure reached out, its shadowy hand brushing against her face. A wave of cold washed over her, and the world around her dissolved into nothingness. The cold was unbearable, seeping into Sarah's bones and gripping her heart with icy fingers. She gasped for breath, her vision blurred as the world slowly began to take shape again. This time she was no longer in the cavern. She was back in the house. But it wasn't the same. The walls were twisted and warped, pulsating as if alive. Shadows darted across the room, their movements too fast to follow, too erratic to ignore. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and a faint whispering filled her ears, too low to make out the words but unmistakably there. Sarah scrambled to her feet, the knife back in her hand as though it had never left. She spun in place, her eyes scanning for any sign of the figure that had emerged from the box. "Where am I?" she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping until they became a deafening roar. She pressed her hands to her ears, dropping the knife, but it did little to muffle the sound. "You're where you belong," a voice said, cutting through the cacophony like a blade. Sarah turned toward the sound, her stomach lurching as she saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was taller now, its form more solid, but its features were no less horrifying. The glowing eyes, the stretched grin, they seemed to mock her. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "You invited me in. You opened the door. Now I'll show you what's behind it." Before she could respond, the floor beneath her feet began to shift. The wood splintered and cracked, revealing a swirling abyss below, filled with writhing shadows and piercing screams. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding as the ground gave way piece by piece. She was trapped, the walls closing in, forcing her closer to the edge. "Stop!" she cried, her voice barely audible over the roar of the abyss. The figure laughed, a sound that chilled her to the core. "There's no stopping this. You belong to me now." The floor beneath her collapsed entirely, and Sarah fell, her screams swallowed by the darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in a place that defied explanation. The ground was made of blackened stone, cracked and uneven, and the sky above was a swirling mass of gray and red, lightning streaking across it with no sound. In the distance, towering spires of jagged rock jutted into the air, their surfaces covered in the same glowing markings she had seen in the cavern. Sarah's breath hitched as she realized she wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. Their whispers filled the air, growing louder as they moved closer. "No," she whispered, taking a step back. "This can't be happening." The figure appeared again, materializing out of the shadows as though it had always been there. "You're starting to understand," it said, its voice dripping with satisfaction. "Understand what?" Sarah shouted, her fear giving way to anger. "Why are you doing this to me?" The figure's grin faltered, just for a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like sadness. "You opened the door," it repeated. "You let me in. And now you'll see." Before she could ask what it meant, the ground beneath her feet began to change. Images appeared in the stone, like a warped mirror showing glimpses of another world. She saw herself standing in her apartment, looking out the window. The street below was empty, the world outside eerily quiet. The scene shifted, and she saw the moment she had opened her door, the figure waiting on the other side. She saw herself hesitate, saw the moment she let it in. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what you were." The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "It doesn't matter. You opened the door and now you're here." Sarah's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands clutching her head as the images continued to play out before her. She saw herself walking through the house, saw the note on the table, the rocking chair, the mirror. And then she saw something she hadn't noticed before. In every scene, the figure was there. Always watching, always waiting. Her breath caught as the realization hit her. "You've been here all along," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded, its grin returning. "You invited me in long before you opened the door. All it took was a moment of fear, a crack in your mind. And I slipped through." Sarah shook her head, her tears falling freely. "No, I didn't." "Yes," the figure interrupted, its voice rising. "You did. And now you'll stay." The ground beneath her began to crack again, the abyss returning. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as the shadows closed in. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "There has to be a way out." The figure's grin widened, its eyes glowing brighter. "There is no out. There's only me. And you." The ground gave way and Sarah fell once more, the darkness consuming her. Sarah's fall seemed endless, the void around her pulling her deeper into its suffocating grip. The figure's haunting laughter echoed in her mind, a sound that gnawed at her sanity. And then, with a sudden jarring impact, she landed. Her body ached as she pushed herself up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick, heavy, and suffused with a faint glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. She was in another place. This new landscape was desolate and eerie. The ground was smooth, almost glass-like, reflecting a distorted version of the dark sky above. Twisted, gnarled trees rose sporadically, their leafless branches clawing at the heavens. In the distance, a faint, rhythmic sound reached her ears, a pulsing like the slow beat of a colossal heart. Sarah looked around, her grip tightening on the knife, though she doubted it would be of any use here. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of her own footsteps as she cautiously moved forward. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay still. The rhythmic pulse grew louder as she walked, and the air grew colder. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, tall, thin figures with hollow eyes and mouths that seemed frozen in silent screams. They didn't move, but they were watching her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she quickened her pace, her instincts screaming at her to get away. The figures didn't follow, but their presence felt like a weight pressing down on her, suffocating and inescapable. The pulsing sound grew louder still, and she found herself standing before a massive structure. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a towering organic mass of stone and shadow, pulsating in time with the heartbeat-like rhythm. A door stood at its base, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when she looked at them. Her instincts told her to turn back, but she knew there was no escape. Not unless she faced whatever waited inside. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open. Inside was a chamber, vast and empty except for a pedestal in the center. On it lay an object wrapped in tattered cloth, much like the box she had seen before. But this was different. The object seemed to call to her, its presence pulling at her very soul. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space like heat waves on a summer road. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart racing. The knife felt heavier in her hand, as though it too was reacting to whatever lay before her. As she reached out to touch the cloth, a voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Stop." She froze, spinning around to find the figure standing behind her. But this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy forms filled the chamber, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They were identical to the figure she had seen before, but their movements were disjointed, jerky, as though they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "You've come this far," the figure said, its voice layered with malice and mockery. "Do you really think you'll leave now?" Sarah's grip on the knife tightened. "What is this place? Why me?" The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound. "You opened the door. You brought yourself here. You're the only one who can end this." The weight of its words settled over her like a shroud. She turned back to the object on the pedestal, her mind racing. Was this the source of it all? Could destroying it free her from this nightmare? The figure stepped closer, its grin widening. "Go on," it whispered. "Touch it. See what lies beneath." Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cloth. Suddenly the room erupted in chaos. The shadowy figures surged forward, their movements frantic and wild. The air filled with a deafening roar, the sound of countless voices screaming in unison. Sarah stumbled back, her mind reeling. The cloth fell away, revealing a mirror, its surface dark and rippling like liquid. But it wasn't her reflection staring back at her. It was the figure, its grin stretching impossibly wide, its hollow eyes glowing with malevolent light. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as the figure in the mirror reached out, its hand breaching the surface. The shadows in the room closed in, their forms merging and twisting until they became indistinguishable from the darkness around her. The figure stepped through the mirror, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It towered over her, its grin fading into a look of pure hatred. "You should have stayed away," it hissed, its voice echoing in her mind. Sarah's instincts kicked in. She raised the knife and plunged it into the figure's chest. The world around her exploded in light. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The morning sun streamed through the window, and the familiar sounds of the city filled the air. But something was wrong. The shadows in the room were too long, too dark. And in the reflection of the window, she saw it. The figure, its hollow eyes staring back at her. "Did you think it would be that easy?" it whispered, its voice sending chills down her spine. Sarah's scream echoed through the apartment as the shadows closed in. Sarah's scream hung in the air, but no sound escaped her lips. The world around her was suffocatingly quiet. The figure in the reflection of the window didn't move. It just stared with those hollow, glowing eyes, unblinking and patient, as if waiting for her next move. "This isn't real," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I got out. I stabbed you. You're gone?" The figure's grin slowly spread, its reflection rippling like disturbed water. "Out?" it hissed, the sound like 1,000 whispers layered together. "There is no out. You're part of this now. Forever." Sarah stumbled backward, her chest heaving as panic clawed at her throat. She turned away from the window only to see the shadows in her apartment moving, sliding along the walls, pooling in corners, stretching toward her like grasping hands. "No, no, no," she cried, clutching the knife still in her hand. The voice filled the room, cold and mocking. "You can't fight what's already inside you." The knife felt heavier, almost burning in her grasp. When she looked down, her heart stopped. The blade was dripping with a dark, viscous liquid, as though it had absorbed the very essence of the figure she had stabbed. And then it hit her. The figure wasn't the source of the nightmare. The knife was. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of the ordeal. The note in the house had mentioned a price, but she hadn't understood it at the time. The box, the figure, the mirror, all distractions. The knife had been with her from the beginning, urging her forward, binding her to the nightmare. "You're clever," the figure said, its voice circling her like a predator stalking its prey. But cleverness won't save you. Sarah tightened her grip on the knife, her knuckles white. If the knife was the source, she had to destroy it. But how? The shadows around her grew darker, more oppressive, as if sensing her intentions. She ran to the kitchen, her heart pounding, and turned on the stove. The flames roared to life, and she held the knife above them, hoping to burn away whatever curse it carried. The shadows screamed, a deafening wail that made her ears ring. The apartment trembled, the walls cracking and splintering as the figure's voice grew louder. "You think you can destroy me?" it bellowed. "You are me." The knife glowed red-hot in the flames, but it didn't melt or crack. Instead, the dark liquid on the blade seemed to writhe, fighting against the heat. Sarah gritted her teeth, forcing the blade closer to the fire. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. The shadows surged toward her, wrapping around her arms and legs, pulling her away from the stove. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but they were too strong. And then she remembered the mirror. With a burst of adrenaline, Sarah wrenched herself free and sprinted back to the living room. The mirror she had seen before, the one that had reflected the figure, was still there, its surface shimmering like liquid. She raised the knife, the shadows clawing at her heels, and plunged it into the mirror. The world exploded in light and sound. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the cavern. The pedestal was empty, the mirror gone. The figure stood before her, but it was different now. Smaller, weaker, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You think this ends it?" it rasped, its voice filled with venom. Sarah stood her ground, the knife still in her hand. She was no longer afraid. "It ends here," she said firmly. The figure laughed weakly, its body dissolving into the shadows. "There's no escape, Sarah. Not for you. Not ever." And then it was gone. She woke up in her apartment, the morning sun streaming through the window. The knife was gone, the shadows still and silent. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was calm. But as she sat on the edge of her bed, her gaze drifted to the corner of the room. There, barely visible, was a faint outline, a shadow that didn't belong. Sarah's chest tightened. She wasn't free. Not completely. The figure's final words echoed in her mind. "There's no escape, Sarah. Not for you. Not ever." Her hand reached for the empty space on her nightstand where the knife had been, and she realized with chilling certainty that the nightmare wasn't over. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. If you felt the tension, the fear, and the thrill of Sarah's story, there are countless others like it, each darker than the last. Subscribe to Apex Storyteller, where the shadows come to life, and every story leaves you questioning what's real. Don't miss what's coming next, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones you can't turn away from. Hit the bell icon and stay with us, if you dare. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, hearing something that shouldn't be there? Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it wasn't. What if I told you that what you hear in the dead of night can be the beginning of something that you'll never escape from? Jason Walker had always considered himself a logical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, paranormal activity, or anything that could be explained away by fear. He believed in facts, in reason, in what his eyes could see and his mind could understand. But that was before he moved into apartment 304 on Maple Street. It had seemed like the perfect place when he first found it. Spacious, affordable, and tucked away in a quiet neighborhood in Denver. Everything he needed to escape the stress of city life and focus on his new job. The apartment building was old, sure, but well maintained. Nothing that would give him pause. He had moved in just a few days ago, unpacking his things, setting up his life in what he thought was a perfect little corner of the world. The first night in the new place should have been restful. After all, he'd just completed a long move. He was tired and it was late. He crawled into bed, the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen being the only noise in the apartment. He pulled the covers up to his chin, closed his eyes, and allowed the weight of the day to wash over him. But then it came. A faint creak. Jason stirred, pulling himself from the edge of sleep, but he dismissed it quickly. The building was old. Old buildings creaked, right? It was probably just the floorboards shifting, settling under the weight of the walls and foundation. He sighed and closed his eyes again. Then another creak, louder this time. Jason's eyes snapped open, his body stiffening as the noise echoed in the room. It wasn't the wind, there was no breeze, no open windows. The apartment was completely still. His breath caught in his chest. He sat up slowly, trying to listen for any other sound, any explanation. But there was nothing. The silence in the room felt suffocating, like something was waiting for him to make a move. And then, just as he was about to lay back down, he heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. His name. Jason. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He froze. It couldn't be. No one else was supposed to be here. The apartment was empty. He was alone. His eyes darted around the dark room, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Jason? The voice came again, clear this time, like it was right outside his door. His blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't familiar, and it certainly wasn't anyone he knew. His instincts screamed at him to stay quiet, to stay still, but his curiosity got the better of him. What was it? Who was it? He threw off the covers, his feet hitting the cold floor with a soft thud. He crept toward the door, his body tense, every nerve on edge. With a shaking hand, he reached for the doorknob, his mind racing. It was probably nothing. He was just tired. Just imagining things. Still, he had to check. He had to know. He slowly twisted the knob, and as he did, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Dragging. Jason froze. His hand gripped the doorknob, his knuckles turning white. The footsteps were coming closer, slowly, as though whatever was on the other side was approaching him, step by step. He couldn't see anything. There was only the sound, the dragging steps that seemed to echo from down the hall. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mouth went dry. What was happening? There was no one else in the building, no one he had seen, no one who had come by. And then, just as Jason was about to call out, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Jason held his breath, waiting for something to happen, anything. But there was nothing. The air felt thick, charged, as though the room itself was holding its breath. His hand was still on the doorknob. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. Was it some prank? A neighbor messing with him? Or was there something else at play? He opened the door slowly, his heart pounding in his ears, his muscles tense. But when the door creaked open, the hallway was empty. No one. No footsteps. No shadows. Jason stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the hallway, his body still on edge. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt wrong. He stepped out into the hallway, his feet hesitant against the cold, creaky floorboards. There was no one in sight. The building felt empty, so empty it almost seemed unnatural. And then, just as he turned to head back to his apartment, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A whisper, but louder this time. Jason? It wasn't from the hallway. It wasn't from behind him. No, it was coming from inside the apartment. Jason whipped around, eyes wide in panic. The door to his apartment was wide open. Oh. He had locked it. He was sure of it. His stomach churned as he stared at the open door. With a deep breath, he stepped back toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't know what he was going to find. He didn't know what he was walking into. But he had to know. Jason couldn't sleep. The events of the previous night hung over him like a heavy fog, clouding his mind, making every creak in the apartment sound like a threat. He told himself that it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and stress. But the more he tried to push it away, the more it clung to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was in that apartment with him. The morning came slowly. Jason woke up to the pale light of dawn creeping through the window, casting long shadows on the walls. It was quiet now, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring with anticipation of something to come. He had barely slept. His mind raced all night, running through every possible explanation for the strange happenings. But nothing made sense. He got out of bed and stretched, trying to shake off the lingering unease. It was a new day and he needed to focus. His job in the city was demanding, and he couldn't afford to let distractions, no matter how eerie, take him away from that. He went through his morning routine mechanically, brushing his teeth, grabbing a quick breakfast. He kept telling himself it was just the apartment settling, just some weird coincidence. But deep down, Jason knew it was more than that. As he ate his breakfast, he noticed something odd. The kitchen light flickered. Not just a quick blink, but a long drawn-out flicker, as if the bulb was struggling to stay on. Jason frowned. He hadn't noticed anything wrong with the light when he'd moved in, but maybe it was just old wiring. But then the refrigerator door creaked open. Jason's stomach dropped. He hadn't touched the door. He'd closed it tightly after breakfast. He stood there for a moment, staring at the open refrigerator door, his mind racing for an explanation. It wasn't the wind. There was no draft, no reason why the door would have opened on its own. His pulse quickened. He approached the fridge slowly, trying to stay calm. He reached out and shut the door with a soft thud, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He couldn't let this get to him. He was being ridiculous. But as he turned back toward the kitchen counter, he saw it, a smear of something dark across the floor. Jason froze. He had just mopped the floor the day before, and yet there it was, a dark, greasy stain, as if something had dragged itself across the floor. It wasn't there the night before. He would have noticed it. He would have cleaned it up. A chill ran down his spine. What was going on here? Who, or what, had left that mark? He bent down to inspect it, running his finger along the sticky surface. The texture felt wrong, like oil or something far worse. His stomach churned. This was no ordinary stain. Felt unnatural. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up again, the feeling of being watched creeping over him. Before he could process what was happening, the light above him flickered again. This time it didn't stop. The bulb buzzed, and then with a loud pop, it went out. Darkness enveloped the kitchen, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. He fumbled for the light switch, his hand shaking as he reached out. The kitchen remained dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street outside through the window. Suddenly, the refrigerator hummed to life. The sound was deafening in the silence. Jason's eyes widened in confusion. The refrigerator hadn't been running before. He had turned it off last night. He moved toward the refrigerator again, reaching for the power button on the side. But just as his fingers touched the switch, the humming stopped. The room fell into silence once more. Jason's breath was shallow now. This wasn't just an old building creaking or faulty wiring. It felt intentional. It felt like something was toying with him, like it was waiting for him to react. His pulse quickened, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. He couldn't stay here. Not with that feeling creeping over him, not with the lights flickering and strange marks on the floor. But before he could grab his things, something caught his eye. The hallway door, leading back to his bedroom, was ajar. Jason knew he had shut it before. He was sure of it. Yet now it was open, just a crack, as though someone had been standing there watching him. He didn't even want to look, but something inside of him urged him to. A deep, insistent pull that told him he had to know what was behind that door. Reluctantly, he walked toward the hallway. With every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the very space around him was thickening, pressing in on him. The door creaked as he pushed it open wider, revealing the shadowy hallway beyond. The apartment felt colder now, despite the fact that the heating had been working just fine. He stepped inside, scanning the hallway with cautious eyes. Everything was just as he had left it the night before, except for one thing. A figure was standing at the end of the hallway in the shadows. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, its features obscured by the dim light. For a split second he thought it might be a person, another tenant, a stranger who had gotten in somehow. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized that something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there watching him. Jason's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood there, frozen in place, staring at the silhouette. Something wasn't right. The figure didn't belong in the apartment. It shouldn't have been there. And then, without warning, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as though it had never been. Jason's heart hammered in his chest, his mind reeling. Had he imagined it? Had it been his mind playing tricks on him? But deep down he knew better. He wasn't imagining this. Whatever it was real. In that moment, Jason understood. He wasn't alone. Something was in this apartment with him, something dark and ancient, something that was watching him. And now it knew he was aware of it. He couldn't explain what was happening. He couldn't explain why the lights flickered, why the refrigerator door opened on its own, or why the figure had appeared in the hallway. All he knew was that he had to get out. But the door to the outside world wasn't just closed. It was locked. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, staring at the now locked door. It was an old door with a thick, sturdy lock that he was sure he hadn't touched. The cold metal of the lock glinted in the faint light, its presence mocking him. There was no explanation for it. No rational reason why the door wouldn't open. He twisted the handle again, then rattled it forcefully. Nothing. The door refused to budge. A shiver crawled up his spine. It wasn't just the door. The whole apartment had changed. The air felt heavier, thick with something he couldn't quite place. Something that wasn't just in the building but in him too. He couldn't tell if he was afraid or furious or both. All he knew was that he needed to get out. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. The apartment was silent now, eerily so. Too quiet. For the first time since he moved in, he felt truly alone. Not the good kind of alone where he could relax and find peace, but the kind of alone where every shadow in the room felt like it was hiding something, where every creak in the floorboards could be something watching him. Suddenly there was a sound. A tapping. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the apartment, just beyond his bedroom door. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The sound was almost mechanical, like fingernails tapping against wood, or a small stone striking glass. It echoed in the silence, and Jason's pulse quickened. Who could be making that noise? Was it another tenant? Had someone snuck in? His mind scrambled for any logical explanation. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. He felt his instincts scream at him to leave, to run far away, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. Every inch of him screamed to open the bedroom door and find the source of that tapping. He didn't want to, but he had to. Jason took a step toward the door, his legs trembling under him. He reached out and grabbed the knob. It was cold. Too cold. Almost as though the doorknob had been in the fridge for hours. A sense of dread washed over him as he twisted the handle, pushing the door open just a crack. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jason stood frozen, staring into the room. His mind raced. What was in there? What had made that noise? And then, as if the apartment itself was playing a cruel game with him, a whisper broke the silence. Jason? The voice was so soft, so faint, it might have been the wind or a trick of his imagination. But Jason felt his stomach twist. It was unmistakable. It was the same voice he'd heard the night before. The voice that had called his name in the darkness. His breath hitched. He had to get out. He had to leave. But how? The door wouldn't open. His phone was in the bedroom just a few feet away, but that was where the voice was coming from. He couldn't stay in here any longer. Before he could even make a decision, the lights flickered just like the night before. The bulb above his head buzzed, flickered a few times, and then exploded with a sharp pop. Darkness swallowed the room whole, leaving Jason standing in the hallway, his heart thumping in his chest. He stepped back, bumping into the wall behind him, his hand instinctively reaching for the light switch. Nothing. The apartment seemed to be playing tricks on him. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the shadows stretching longer and longer with each passing second. He felt a cold hand wrap around his throat, choking him with the very air around him. The voice came again, louder this time, as if it were right behind him. Jason? Jason spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. The kind of darkness that made him feel like he had no body, no voice, no escape. Suddenly the tapping came back, this time faster. Like footsteps moving swiftly across the floor. Jason's heart raced. Someone, or something, was in the apartment with him. He wasn't alone. He knew that much now. He turned and sprinted for the door, desperate to escape, but before he could even touch the handle, a loud crash sounded from behind him. It was the sound of something heavy falling, something breaking. Jason whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. The bedroom door slammed shut. Jason ran toward it, pulling at the door handle with everything he had, but it wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder into it, trying to break it open, but nothing. The door was solid, unyielding. His pulse was pounding in his ears as he stepped back, eyes wide with panic. And then, in the silence that followed, he heard it. The distinct sound of something dragging along the floor, slowly, agonizingly slow. It was coming from the bedroom. Jason's knees buckled beneath him and he collapsed to the floor. He had to escape. He couldn't stay here. Whatever it was, whatever force had taken hold of the apartment, it was getting stronger. It was no longer a simple whisper or flickering light. It was something far worse, something Jason couldn't name, something that wasn't going to stop until it had him. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the hallway and the lights flickered back on. But it wasn't the usual soft flicker. No, this time the lights flickered erratically, blinking in and out of existence. Jason's eyes went wide as the shadows in the room seemed to twist and writhe. The room felt alive, like the darkness itself was moving. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and Jason knew without a doubt that whatever was in that room with him was coming for him. The voice whispered once more, "Jason." And then, just as the sound of dragging stopped, everything fell silent. The apartment was still. Too still. Jason's breath was shallow, his body trembling with fear, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. He had to act. But what could he do? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself. He had to think. What was going on? Was it some kind of prank? Was he losing his mind? But when he opened his eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, was the figure again. The same silhouette, tall and shrouded in darkness. And this time it was moving. Not toward him, but away, as if it wanted him to follow. Jason couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone, and his body was frozen in place as the figure, that same dark silhouette, slowly retreated into the bedroom. His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet refused to obey. It was as if the very air around him had turned to quicksand, holding him in place, making every second feel like an eternity. The figure didn't turn around. It didn't acknowledge him. It simply moved further into the darkness, its form growing more and more indistinct with each passing moment. The shadows in the room seemed to swallow it whole, until in an instant it was gone. Jason stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been, his chest heaving with every shallow breath. What was it? What did it want? He couldn't take it anymore. The oppressive silence in the apartment felt like it was choking him. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the shadows, everything was too much. He had to leave. He had to escape. With great effort, he forced his body into motion, turning toward the door. The lock was still in place, but in that moment, Jason wasn't concerned with the door. He wasn't concerned with anything other than getting out of that apartment. But as he reached for the doorknob, a sudden coldness washed over him. a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to freeze him to the core. His breath caught in his throat and he staggered back, his body trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the feeling of something watching him again. Something close. Too close. Jason spun around, his eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of that presence. But everything was still. Silent. The apartment felt suffocatingly empty. But Jason knew better now. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. The air had changed. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Every shadow, every corner of the room felt like it was hiding something. Something that didn't belong. And then the whisper came again. But this time it wasn't soft or distant. It was clear. Right in his ear. Jason? His breath hitched in his throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had haunted him from the very first night, but now it sounded different, more desperate, more insistent. The words sent a wave of cold fear through him, making his skin crawl. Jason spun around again, his eyes wide, searching for the source. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows, the darkness, the silence. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure just out of reach, standing in the hallway. At first, it was barely a silhouette, a fleeting shadow that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. But as Jason stared, it began to take shape. Slowly. Relentlessly. The figure was taller now, its form more defined, but still shrouded in darkness. It was moving toward him, not quickly but steadily. Its steps were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment, savoring Jason's fear. Jason's heart raced. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away from the figure that was drawing closer with each agonizing second. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just his name. "Come closer, Jason." Jason's stomach twisted. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. A demand. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. He could feel it now. The presence. It wasn't just in the apartment. It was in him too. Crawling beneath his skin, tugging at the edges of his sanity. With every step the figure took, Jason's resolve weakened. His legs felt like they were made of rubber. His vision blurred as panic took hold. He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape. But no matter where he looked, the way out seemed to vanish. The apartment felt like a maze, each turn leading him deeper into its clutches. The hallway stretched longer, the walls closing in tighter, suffocating him in the dark. And then, as if the apartment itself was mocking him, the figure stopped, just a few feet away from him. It stood there, motionless, watching him with eyes that he couldn't see, eyes that made him feel like he was being peeled open from the inside out. Jason's breath quickened. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The fear was overwhelming, flooding his senses, drowning out everything else. The figure tilted its head as if studying him. And then it spoke again. "You've been waiting for me, Jason." His stomach churned. Waiting? What was it talking about? He didn't even know what it was. He didn't know why it was here or why it was after him. Jason took a step back, his mind spinning. I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow step forward, its shadow stretching toward him like a living thing, wrapping itself around him, making him feel trapped, suffocated. Jason gasped, trying to break free, but the more he moved, the more the darkness seemed to close in on him. It was like he was being drawn into the very walls of the apartment, the shadows swallowing him whole. He stumbled backward, his hands groping for anything to hold on to. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. The doorknob. Without thinking, he turned it. The door burst open with a sudden rush of air, and Jason rushed out into the hallway. But even as he stepped into the hallway, the air seemed to grow colder, thicker. The shadows clung to him, whispering his name, pulling him back. His heart was pounding in his chest as he ran, not knowing where he was going, just knowing that he had to get away. He turned the corner into another hallway, only to find it leading to another dark room. And then another. And another. It was as if the apartment had no end. As if every corner, every hallway, was leading him deeper into a place that didn't exist, a place where he was no longer in control. And in the distance he heard it. The soft sound of footsteps following him. Not his. Someone else's. Someone, or something, was coming for him. And Jason had no idea how to escape. Jason's mind raced as he sprinted down the endless corridors, his heart pounding violently in his chest. Every turn he took seemed to lead him deeper into the apartment complex. The hallways stretched on, curving in unnatural angles, and no matter how fast he ran, the light ahead seemed to grow dimmer, the shadows longer. It was as if the very building was alive, shifting and rearranging itself to trap him. He had no idea how long he had been running, but it felt like hours. He stumbled over his own feet, dizzy and disoriented, his breath ragged and shallow. The noise behind him, the footsteps that had been following him, growing louder with each passing moment, had stopped. But that didn't make him feel any safer. No, it was worse. The silence now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. And then he heard it again. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, but it was there, and it was calling his name. Jason? Jason's blood ran cold. He stopped dead in his tracks, his head spinning, trying to locate the source of the voice. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure standing there, watching him. But there was nothing. Just an empty hallway. The walls seemed to stretch further into the distance, disappearing into an endless void of darkness. But the voice came again. This time it was clearer. Jason? It wasn't the same voice as before. It wasn't the whisper of the shadowy figure. This voice felt familiar, soft, comforting, like the sound of someone he had known his entire life, someone he had loved. Mom? Jason whispered, his voice trembling with uncertainty. But the moment the word left his lips, the air around him grew colder, thicker. The temperature dropped, the chills sinking into his bones like icy tendrils. His breath came out in visible clouds, the mist hanging in the air as though the very atmosphere had turned to ice. His mind spun as memories flooded back to him, uninvited, unbidden. His childhood, his mother, the accident. Jason had pushed it all down, buried it deep inside of him. He had to move on. But now, in this twisted place, those memories came rushing back, crashing over him in waves. He could almost hear the sound of her voice, soft and soothing, just like it used to be. But there was something wrong. There was something distorted about it, as if it had been twisted by some dark force. Mom? Jason whispered again, his voice cracking. Is that you? The walls around him seemed to close in, the hallway narrowing. The shadows lengthened, twisting like dark hands reaching for him. He took a step forward, hesitant, unsure whether he should continue down this path. He didn't want to. But the voice, it was calling to him. It was pulling him in like a thread, drawing him closer and closer to the truth he had spent so long trying to forget. He took another step and then another. The farther he went, the stronger the feeling grew, like something was watching him. Something was waiting for him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. The silence that followed was deafening. He stood in the middle of the hallway, his heart racing, his entire body trembling with fear and confusion. What was happening? What was he supposed to do? The walls felt like they were pressing in on him, the shadows growing darker and darker, and yet Jason felt compelled to move forward. There was something at the end of this hallway. Something he needed to see. The floor beneath his feet creaked with every step, the sound echoing in the hollow space around him. His pulse raced, and his every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place behind and never return. But he couldn't. He couldn't ignore the pull of the voice, the way it beckoned to him, urging him to keep going. He reached the end of the hallway where a door stood ajar. It was a wooden door, old and worn, the kind that looked like it had been left untouched for years. But there was something about it, something about the way the light flickered from behind it, that made Jason's blood run cold. The door was slightly open, just wide enough for him to see into the room beyond. It was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from somewhere inside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jason stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door handle. He hesitated for a moment, then gripped it tightly, his palms slick with sweat. The door creaked open. As soon as he stepped inside, the room felt like a different world entirely. The air was thick, stagnant, as though it had been trapped here for years. The room was small, filled with dust and cobwebs. Old furniture was scattered around, covered in faded sheets. But there, in the center of the room, was a large, ornate mirror. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The mirror was beautiful, with intricate carvings along the edges, but it was not the craftsmanship that drew him in. It was the way the mirror seemed to shimmer, almost as if it were alive. The surface rippled like water, distorting the reflection of the room, creating strange shapes and movements that didn't belong. And then he saw it. A face. A familiar face. It was his own. But it wasn't just his reflection. The face in the mirror was different. The eyes were darker, hollow. The expression twisted into something almost unrecognizable, a grotesque parody of the person he had once been. His own reflection seemed to smirk at him, mocking him as if it knew something he didn't. Jason stepped back, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The reflection in the mirror didn't answer, but something else did. A voice, soft, familiar. "Come closer, Jason." Jason's stomach churned. His heart raced in his chest as the voice echoed in his ears. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of the twisted reflection that seemed to grow more real with every passing second. And then the reflection moved. It smiled. A smile that wasn't his. The air in the room shifted. The shadows seemed to writhe, and Jason could feel something pulling at him, dragging him closer to the mirror. He fought against it, his body screaming to break free, but it was like the mirror had a hold on him, like it was feeding on his fear, drawing him in deeper and deeper. The voice came again, stronger this time. "Come to me, Jason. It's time." Jason's eyes locked onto his reflection, and for the first time, he understood. This wasn't just a mirror. This was a door. A door to something else. Something dark. Something ancient. And he was about to step through it. Jason's fingers trembled against the cold, polished surface of the mirror. The reflection in the glass twisted and swirled, its eyes still locked onto his with that sinister, mocking grin. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. A part of him. A part that he hadn't realized was buried so deep inside. "Come closer, Jason," the voice purred again, its tone both soothing and terrifying. Jason's mind was racing. He could feel the weight of the voice pulling at him, like invisible hands that wanted to drag him into the mirror, into whatever world existed behind it. His pulse quickened, his chest tight with panic, yet his legs refused to move. The reflection was him, but it wasn't. It was distorted, changed. His face had aged in the glass, his eyes sunken and dark. His lips curled in a way that wasn't natural. The person staring back at him didn't seem to be human. There was something far darker lurking beneath the surface. He stepped back, his breath shallow, desperate for air, but the mirror seemed to pull him in even more. It felt like the room around him was vanishing, the walls growing thinner, the edges of reality blurring. The space seemed to twist and bend, as if the very fabric of his world was warping around the glass. "Please no," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible, as if even speaking the words could make the darkness real. But something inside of him urged him to listen. Something primal, ancient, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. A deep, buried memory, a past he had buried so deep that it had festered into this living nightmare. His hand reached out involuntarily, fingers brushing the mirror's surface. It was cold, unnaturally so. The temperature of the room seemed to drop further, frost beginning to form along the edges of the glass, creeping along the floor like vines. Jason's fingers burned as they made contact with the mirror, a sharp, stinging pain shooting up his arm. But he couldn't pull away. His body wasn't his own anymore. "Step through, Jason. It's time. You've always known it. Always been mine." The voice filled his mind, drowning out everything else. The world around him began to distort, the walls bending like rubber, the furniture melting into puddles of dark liquid. The sounds of the apartment, the creaking wood, the hum of the old refrigerator, vanished, replaced by an eerie silence, thick with dread. Jason's breath came in short gasps. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, but he couldn't focus on anything except the reflection. It was speaking to him, its voice like a song he had known for years but couldn't recall. His limbs felt like lead, his movements slow and deliberate. The reflection in the glass was pulling him closer. And then it happened. The mirror began to ripple, the surface distorting as if it were water. The air around him vibrated with an energy he couldn't understand. A force, cold and unyielding, gripped his chest. Jason's hand slid through the mirror. It was like passing through a veil of ice-cold water, his skin crawling as the sensation made his entire body feel like it was being pulled apart. He gasped, stumbling, his eyes wide with terror, but his hand remained locked in place. It felt as if the mirror was alive, as if it were feeding off his fear, drawing him in. His entire arm passed through, then his shoulder, and before he could think, his head followed. The world exploded into darkness. Jason fell forward, unable to catch himself. The sensation of falling lasted far longer than it should have. It was as if time itself was suspended in that moment, his body weightless, suspended in some unseen void. And then, with a sudden jolt, the sensation stopped. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact jarring his bones, and his body crumpled into the cold earth beneath him. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. His breath echoed in the vast emptiness that surrounded him. It was pitch black, but he could sense something, or rather, someone. There was a presence, a terrible, looming force watching him, waiting for him to wake up from the nightmare that had only just begun. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes wide as he struggled to push himself off the ground. He looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but there was nothing. Nothing except for an oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down on him. It was a void, a place where light didn't exist. A place that felt like the edges of reality had crumbled. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, just a silhouette at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. A tall, dark shape, standing unmoving in the distance. Its form was humanoid, but distorted, warped. Jason couldn't see its face, but he felt its eyes, cold, malicious, burning into him. It felt like it was inside him, clawing at his thoughts, pulling him deeper into despair. Jason tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was frozen in place, his body unable to react, caught in the grip of whatever dark force had taken hold of him. The figure took a step forward, its long, shadowy limbs moving with an unnatural grace. And then, just like that, it spoke. "You don't belong here, Jason." The voice was a low growl, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. "But you're here now, and there's no way out." Jason's throat went dry. His chest tightened with panic. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. He had to wake up. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way home. But the figure didn't give him a chance to think. With a sudden violent motion, it lunged forward, and Jason felt a cold, iron grip wrap around his throat. The darkness closed in on him, and he gasped for breath, clawing at the unseen force. His vision blurred as his thoughts began to fade, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He felt himself falling deeper and deeper into the void. And just before everything went black, one final, bone-chilling whisper reached his ears. "You're mine, Jason." Jason's mind swam in a haze of confusion. Every inch of his body screamed in agony as the darkness closed in around him. He was falling endlessly into a pit of cold nothingness. His limbs flailed as though he were drowning, but there was no water. Just the suffocating, empty void that swallowed everything. His breath was ragged, his lungs aching, but he couldn't make a sound. The darkness was too thick, too heavy. The figure, whatever it was, still held him, its cold grip tightening with every passing second. The shadows seemed to crawl over him, seeping into his skin, consuming him from the inside out. He was being pulled deeper into the abyss, his very soul at risk of being torn apart. "Let me go," Jason gasped, but no words came out. His voice was swallowed by the dark, as though even his screams were meaningless here. The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. The force holding him didn't need words. It was something much more ancient, much more powerful. Jason could feel it. A presence, a force that had been waiting for him, for this moment, for his surrender. But Jason refused to give in. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Fighting against the invisible force, he managed to force his eyes open, despite the overwhelming darkness. And when he did, he saw something that froze him in place. A single, faint light, far in the distance. So far that it seemed impossible, a speck of brightness in a world consumed by shadow. It was hope. His heart surged with renewed energy, a fire igniting in his chest. The darkness may have taken his body, but it hadn't taken his will. Not yet. Jason pushed against the suffocating shadows, his every instinct urging him to reach the light. He clawed at the air, each movement heavy, like swimming through thick molasses. But the light, his only chance, was growing brighter, closer. With a cry that echoed in the abyss, Jason forced his legs to move, his body burning with the effort. He pushed through the suffocating grip of the shadows, feeling the weight of the figure's presence behind him, but he didn't dare look back. Every step felt like a battle, every breath an act of defiance. The light grew larger, now a beacon in the distance, calling to him. It pulsed, brighter with every second, as if the very energy of the universe was flowing toward him. But just as he thought he was close enough to reach it, something stopped him. A voice. This time it wasn't the deep growl of the figure. It wasn't the whisper from before. It was something else, something eerily familiar. "Jason?" The voice was gentle, soft, like a mother calling her child. But there was no warmth in it, no love. It was cold, hollow, twisted. "Jason, you can't escape. Not from me." Jason froze. He couldn't move. The voice was suffocating, and it was coming from inside his mind now. It was the same voice he had heard before, the one that called his name from the dark corners of his memories. The voice of the thing that had been with him since the beginning. It wasn't a force of darkness. It was something more. It was him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His body tensed, his mind reeling with the truth. This wasn't just some shadow, some evil force that had taken him. No, it was a part of him. Something darker, more twisted, that he had buried so deep within himself that he had never realized it was alive. The memories came flooding back to him in a rush. The accident, his mother, the years of guilt and grief that had followed. How he had never truly let go. How he had pushed his feelings down, buried them beneath layers of denial, hoping they would disappear. But they hadn't. They had been waiting for the right moment. And now, here in this place of darkness, they had come alive. "You think you can escape, Jason?" The voice whispered again, closer this time. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding him, filling his mind. "You can't. You've always known. This is your fate. This is what you are." Jason gritted his teeth, fighting against the suffocating grip of the shadows, his body trembling with the weight of the truth. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't let this happen. But the light, was still there, pulsing, growing brighter. He could almost feel it within his reach. If he could just reach it. "You'll never make it," the voice taunted, its laugh like ice scraping against bone. "You're mine, Jason. Always have been." The figure appeared before him in the shadows, its face now visible, distorted, warped, but unmistakable. It was him. His own reflection, but twisted. The darkness was taking his soul, erasing who he had been. Jason could feel it now, a coldness inside of him, deep in his chest. He couldn't breathe. The weight of his past, his mistakes, the things he had done and the things he had failed to do, it all rushed back, suffocating him. But the light was still there, still calling to him. He made one last, desperate push forward, his body shuddering, his thoughts fragmented. The light was so close now, within reach. And then, with a final, defiant breath, Jason reached out. The light surrounded him, engulfing him. The darkness screamed, the voice screeched in frustration, but it was too late. Jason was pulled into the light. But as his body disappeared into the brightness, one last whisper followed him, cold and cruel. "You'll never be free."